lenses of analysis, and historical determinism.
One of the best ways to think about history is to think about it as a science, and then to realize it's not a science. History is a collection of events that we study and then try and gather lessons from that study of those lessons. And in the end, the things I'm going to talk about today in this short video are about the lenses of analysis we use in history, so the way we look at things in history, and then also about historical determinism, the way in which things that happen in history determine the course of history.
Determinism, causality.
There are two key concepts in history that are extremely closely related. One is determinism and the other one is causality. And they basically mean the same thing from different points of view. So in history, certain things cause other things. That's causality. There's an assumption that this couldn't have happened without this previous thing. The sort of flip side of that is the idea of determinism, that something happens and that determines the possible future or the actual future of the things that happen later. So causality is the idea of this caused that. Determinism is the idea of this determined that. Determinism generally has the idea that it narrows down the possibilities. So, in a historical moment, there are only so many things that can happen because of a whole lot of variables, and therefore the course of history is determined. And the various things that actually do happen cause other things to happen, which is causality. And the whole idea here is that history is not just some random set of events that happen. It's not accidental. There are things that determine the course of history, things that cause history to happen in particular ways.
History does not believe in fate. The future is changeable.
A key idea here is that history doesn't really believe in fate. The idea that there is some pre-written definitive way that things have to be, that things happened in the past because that's how they were written or that's how they were fated to happen. If history makes any sense at all, the idea of history is that things didn't have to happen that way, and they happened that way because of a series of causal events and deterministic things that shaped history in particular ways. And because history isn't fated, that means that the future is also not fated, which is the whole point of history. So the idea behind history is that if you actually understand it, you study it, you look at it, you actually figure out the proper lessons that history is trying to teach, which things determine which later events, which things cause which later events, we can then take those lessons and apply them to our own present and therefore determine the course of history moving forward into the future.
Individual actor determinism.
One of the things that determines the course of history could just be individual actors. There are definitely cases, I think, in history where you have a specific human, and if that specific human hadn't existed, things would not have gone the way they did. Alexander the Great was probably a perfectly suited human for building this massive empire, and had he been hit by an ox cart, he wouldn't have built his empire.
Technological determinism.
Technological determinism is another determinism that people find very credible and that clearly is important. Before the invention of the automobile and petrol or oil-based energy sources, there were a whole lot of things that just absolutely were not possible. So clearly, like, technological discoveries occasionally rapidly shape, the history and the course of events. Had the Aztecs not been in the Stone Age when Hernan Cortés showed up, there would have been a very different history there. So the technology in that moment really clearly caused history to happen in specific ways.
Political or intellectual determinism.
Political or intellectual determinism is another determinism that used to be more popular than it is right now. Here the idea would be that history can't happen in the way it happens until a particular idea is thought up or until a particular political form shows up. So here the idea would be that, say, society really couldn't have advanced really rapidly in the last 200 years if democracy, modern democracy, hadn't been invented and put into place. Like, democracy made certain other things possible, and therefore the politics of democracy shaped the course of history. Other times it's some idea that somebody finally thinks up, like that, the earth is round. It's kind of a scientific thing, but it's not really a technological thing. It's an intellectual thing. And until you have that realization, there are certain other things that can't happen in history. So this would be intellectual or political determinism.
Ecological determinism.
Ecological determinism is anything having to do with plants, animals, diseases, and stuff like that. While I'm making this video, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is clearly changing the course of history in really radical ways. What we can do presently in the world, everywhere, is determined by the existence of this virus right now. The history of the dinosaurs was determined by the fact that a giant asteroid slammed into the north of the Yucatan and wiped them out.
Economic determinism.
Economic determinism is the one everyone believes, from Karl Marx to Adam Smith to Donald Trump. Everybody knows that money helps shape the course of history. If you control the factories and the banks and all the cash, you're going to get to determine the course of history a bit more importantly than anyone else.
Family structure and gender roles.
Gender roles also obviously determine the course of history. For the longest time, women couldn't shape history very much because they were kept down by men. Similarly, gay and lesbians were often completely unable to even exist in any kind of safe way because of gender roles. Family structures matter, whether it's run by men or run by women. There are a lot of things in gender that shape the course of history. Cultural determinism, the vague one. And there are obviously like an infinite number of possible determinisms, probably some that haven't been thought of yet. And I'm going to call everything else, just to keep it easy, cultural determinism. And this could include really kind of anything in human culture that shapes the future of history for humans. Ethnic roles. Ethnic determinism also obviously shapes history. You can use the term race if you want to be unscientific about it. Clearly, the history of the United States is shaped by the history of racism or by the history of a sense of ethnic superiority of European white people. And those European white people definitely saw people of Native American descent, people of African descent, people of Asian descent as just lesser than them, and therefore they could take advantage of them in various ways. And without that sense of ethnic roles, racism, you definitely would have seen the history of the United States happen in a different way. Had everyone on the planet looked exactly the same way, the history of America would not have been the same. Racism or ethnic identity really did matter in shaping the history of this country. And it has for other countries as well. It's not just the United States that has negative history of this type. Artistic or other cultural determinism. And there are a ton of other possible things you could lump in under determinisms. Artistic sensibility, like you can't even imagine seeing something in a particular way because the art that you see is what you're normally used to seeing. And in a lot of ways, the artistic and the cultural kind of determinism of history is difficult because you're trying to see patterns that are lost in some larger pattern. And so that is the tricky part about studying history, is figuring out, like, not, the big determinisms are a little easier, but the more subtle determinisms are trickier to actually keep track of and find. And that's kind of what makes history fun, is figuring out what did cause this other thing to happen. Why did that happen that way? The, did it happen part, that's boring. It's kind of exciting because you got to look up the documents and find it. But it's really interesting to talk about why history is as it is. We are wrong right now, but maybe less so than later. And the final idea I'll leave you with is the idea that we're definitely wrong right now. We probably will discover in the next 5, 10, 20 years that everything we're thinking right now is incorrect. Our understanding of history right now is almost certainly incorrect. Every time I look back at previous history, and pretty much anybody does, you see that people have understood the past incorrectly. Either they didn't have the right information, or they were coming out of their own prejudices, their own biases, their own point of view, and they misread history. And that'll happen to us. Like anybody, any humans, any culture that ascribes a truth to anything is almost certainly going to be laughed at by people 50 years in the future. It is, however, also possible that we are less wrong than people in the future, because that also does happen. You can definitely find moments where people in the past thought something was true, and then people later on decided something else was true that was actually less true than what happened with people in the past. So that is an interesting thing. History is always changing. History is a kind of debate we have amongst ourselves about what happened so that we can understand the now and plan for the future. Thank you.